What if the man everyone saw as just another struggling single father actually held the key to saving someone who would change his world forever? What if one night, in the fury of the worst blizzard in decades, a desperate voice crackled through? An old radio, and he was the only one listening? In the remote mountains of Timber Ridge, when all hope seemed lost and rescue seemed impossible, Max Palmer made a choice that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his future. What began as a desperate rescue of Air Force Captain Kira Thorne became something no one could have predicted. But when her emergency orders arrived 3 days later, they contained words that left this quiet single father speechless and changed both their lives in ways neither saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The snow had been falling steadily for 6 hours when Max Palmer finally called it a day. He stood in the doorway of his carpentry workshop, watching the thick flakes dance under the amber glow of the security light, each one adding to what the Weather Service calling the storm of the decade. The workshop, tucked behind his modest 2-story home in Timber Ridge, Montana, still smelled of fresh pine shavings and the coffee he'd forgotten to finish that morning. Max wiped his hands on his well-worn flannel shirt and surveyed the oak dining table he'd been crafting for the Hendersons over in Willowbrook. 3 months of meticulous work, and it was finally ready for delivery. The hand-carved legs stood elegant and strong, each joint fitted with the precision that had earned him a reputation as one of the finest craftsmen in the valley. But with the storm intensifying, delivery would have to wait. At 34, Max had built a life of quiet routine in Timber Ridge. The small mountain town, population barely 800, suited him perfectly. No traffic lights, no chain restaurants. Just Main Street with its handful of family businesses, the old Lutheran church, and streets where everyone knew everyone else's name. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and borrowed sugar from neighbors without asking twice. The front door of the house creaked open, and 8-year-old Sophie Palmer emerged, wrapped in an oversized purple winter coat that made her look like a walking sleeping bag. Her dark hair, so much like her mother's, peeked out from beneath a knitted hat with a ridiculous pom-pom that she'd insisted on wearing, despite Max's gentle protests about its impracticality. "Dad, the power just flickered again," she announced, her breath visible in the cold air. "And the weatherman on TV said we might get 3 feet of snow. 3 feet. That's taller than Mrs. Kowalski's fence." Max smiled despite himself. Sophie had inherited her mother's gift for finding wonder in everything, even impending natural disasters. "That's what backup generators are for, kiddo. Remember when I installed that big gray box behind the shed last spring? The one that sounds like a dragon when it starts up? That's the one." He closed the workshop door and followed Sophie toward the house, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle deep. "We'll be just fine. I've got enough firewood stacked to last us through Christmas, and Mom's old radio still works if we lose the TV signal." The mention of Sarah brought its usual tightness to Max's chest, but he pushed it aside. 3 years had passed since the accident, and he'd learned to live with the hollow spaces in their daily routine. Sophie had been too young to fully understand what they'd lost, but old enough to feel the absence. She still asked about her mother sometimes, usually at bedtime when the house grew quiet and memories seemed to stir in the shadows. Inside, their home reflected the careful balance Max had struck between practicality and comfort. The living room featured furniture he built himself, a sturdy coffee table, bookshelves that lined one entire wall, and a rocking chair where he'd spent countless hours reading bedtime stories. Sophie's artwork covered the refrigerator door, a gallery of stick figures and rainbow houses that changed weekly. The kitchen counter held the remnants of their dinner, mac and cheese from a box, because despite his skills with wood, Max's culinary talents remained stubbornly limited. "Dad, can we build a fort in the living room?" Sophie asked, already pulling cushions from the couch with the determination of a seasoned architect. If we're going to be stuck inside, we might as well make it fun. Max glanced at the window, where the storm was turning the world into a swirling white void. The Weather Service had issued a blizzard warning, advising everyone to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. Highway 12, the main road connecting Timber Ridge to the outside world, would probably be impassable by morning. I think that's a great idea, he said, helping Sophie arrange the cushions. But first, let me check the emergency supplies. We want to make sure we have everything we need. The truth was, Max had been preparing for storms like this since they'd moved to Timber Ridge. The basement storage room contained enough canned goods, bottled water, and batteries to last them 2 weeks. The wood-burning stove in the living room could heat the entire house if the power went out, and he'd taught Sophie how to work the manual can opener and where to find the flashlights. Being prepared wasn't just practical, it was necessary. Out here, 40 miles from the nearest city, you couldn't count on help arriving quickly when things went wrong. Max had learned that lesson the hard way, though he rarely allowed himself to think about the details. Some memories were better left buried, like the reason he'd left his job as a contractor in Denver and retreated to this quiet corner of Montana. Sophie's laughter pulled him back to the present. She'd constructed what could generously be called a blanket fort, though it looked more like a textile explosion. Perfect engineering, Max said with mock seriousness. Though I think you might want to reinforce that corner support. I'm not building a real house, Dad. It's a fort. It's supposed to be messy. Max settled into his rocking chair, watching Sophie arrange her stuffed animals inside her creation. The old emergency radio sat on the shelf beside him, its red LED indicating it was charging. He'd bought it from Walter's Hardware when they'd first moved here, along with a two-way radio and a satellite phone that he hoped he'd never need to use. The storm outside was growing fierce, wind howling through the eaves of the house and rattling the windows. Max had weathered plenty of Montana winters, but this one felt different, more intense, more purposeful, as if the storm had business to conduct in Timber Ridge. Dad, Sophie's voice was quieter now, almost lost in the sound of the wind. What? If someone gets stuck out there, in the storm? Max looked at his daughter, her dark eyes serious with the kind of concern that made her seem older than her 8 years. The sheriff's department and the volunteer fire department are prepared for emergencies. They have special equipment for situations like this. But what if they can't get through? What if someone needs help and nobody can reach them? The questions hit closer to home than Sophie could know. Max had been the person stuck in a storm once, waiting for help that came too late. He'd also been the person who couldn't reach someone who needed him, despite all his preparations and good intentions. Then we hope someone with the right skills happens to be in the right place at the right time, he said softly. Sometimes, ordinary people do extraordinary things when they have to. Sophie nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and returned to organizing her fort. Max remained in his chair, listening to the storm intensify outside. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, his quiet life would be shattered by a voice on the radio. A voice that would force him to become the person he'd once been. The person he'd tried so hard to leave behind. The emergency radio crackled softly on the shelf, its antenna extended, waiting to receive whatever messages the storm might carry through the darkness. At 11:47 p.m., the emergency radio erupted with static so violent, it sounded like the storm itself had invaded the living room. Max jolted awake in his chair, where he'd dozed off while watching Sophie sleep peacefully in her blanket fort. The radio's crackling filled the sudden silence that followed a particularly fierce gust of wind. Max reached for the volume dial, adjusting it carefully. The static ebbed and flowed like electronic breathing, punctuated by what sounded like fragments of human voice. He'd heard emergency transmissions before. Lost hikers, stranded motorists, the occasional medical emergency. But this was different. The signal was weak, desperate, cutting in and out as if the speaker was fighting against more than just atmospheric interference. "8A, Mayday." The voice broke through clearly for just a moment, unmistakably female, strained with exhaustion. And something else Max recognized too well, barely controlled panic. "Aircraft down, repeat. Aircraft down." Max's blood turned to ice water. He turned the volume up higher, his carpenter's hand suddenly unsteady as he fine-tuned the frequency. Sophie stirred in her fort, but didn't wake, her breathing steady and peaceful in stark contrast to the chaos spilling from the radio. "Anyone copy? This is Captain Kira Thorne, U.S. Air Force, emergency frequency." The transmission was clearer now, though still fragmented. "Forced landing approximately." Static consumed the words then. "Coordinates uncertain." "GPS destroyed in impact." Max grabbed a notepad from the side table, his pen hovering over the paper as he strained to catch every word. "Aircraft down." That meant someone was alive, at least for now. But in this storm, in terrain as unforgiving as the Montana Rockies, survival was measured in hours, not days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hypothermia setting in. The voice was weaker now, as if the speaker was conserving energy. "Survival gear limited, please, if anyone can hear this." The signal faded to nothing but static. Max waited, holding his breath, praying for more information. Anything. A location, a landmark, some detail that might help identify where this Air Force captain had come down. The seconds stretched into a full minute of white noise before the voice returned, fainter than before. Near what looks like a cell tower, red light blinking, more static. Then, valley with a frozen lake, can see lights from a town in the distance. Max's pen stopped moving. Cell tower. Red light. Valley with a frozen lake. His mind raced through the topography around Timber Ridge. There were 3 cell towers within a reasonable distance, but only one sat above a valley with a lake and a view of town lights. Whitefish Lake, about 12 miles northeast of Timber Ridge, in terrain that was challenging even in good weather. Getting so cold. The voice was barely a whisper now. "Don't know how much longer." Max looked at his watch. Nearly midnight. If this Captain Thorne had crash-landed hours ago, she was already deep into the danger zone for exposure. Every minute that passed reduced her chances of survival. He glanced toward the window, where the storm showed no signs of letting up. The Weather Service was predicting wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour, with visibility near zero. No rescue helicopter could fly in these conditions. Ground vehicles would be useless in the backcountry terrain between Timber Ridge and Whitefish Lake. The county sheriff's office, what little they had of it, would be overwhelmed just trying to keep the main roads clear and respond to emergencies in town. Max's hands trembled as he reached for the radio's microphone. He'd purchased the two-way capability years ago, but had never used it for anything more serious than checking road conditions with the highway department. Now he keyed the microphone and spoke into the storm. "Captain Thorne, this is Max Palmer in Timber Ridge. I copy your distress call. Can you hear me?" The static seemed to mock him. He tried again, adjusting the frequency slightly. "Captain Thorne, if you can hear this, I'm receiving your signal. I think I know your approximate location." Nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed. Hear you, thank God." Max's heart hammered against his ribs. She was alive, conscious, and receiving his transmission. That was something, but it wasn't enough. "Captain, I need you to save your battery power. Don't transmit unless it's critical. Can you see any other landmarks? Buildings, roads, anything distinctive?" The response came in fragments. "Small cabin, maybe abandoned, about 100 yards, no smoke from chimney." Max closed his eyes, visualizing the area around Whitefish Lake. He'd hiked those trails countless times, usually with Sophie in better weather. There were several old hunting cabins scattered throughout the valley, most of them unused except during deer season. If Captain Thorne could reach one of them, she might have shelter, maybe even basic supplies. Captain, listen carefully. If you can safely reach that cabin, do it. Even if it's locked, break in if you have to. Look for a fireplace, wood stove, anything that can provide heat. Check for emergency supplies, canned food, blankets, maybe a landline phone. Copy that. Her voice was growing weaker. We'll attempt. Save your strength, Max said. I'm going to contact emergency services, see what resources are available. Keep your radio on, but don't transmit unless it's urgent. Conserve your battery. What Max didn't tell her was that he already knew what the emergency services would say. The county had one search and rescue team, composed entirely of volunteers who were probably already dealing with storm-related emergencies closer to town. The state police helicopter was grounded until the weather cleared. The National Guard would respond eventually, but not quickly enough to save someone dying of hypothermia in a mountain valley. Max looked at Sophie, still sleeping peacefully in her fort, oblivious to the crisis unfolding around her. Then he looked at the radio, now silent except for the steady hiss of static. Somewhere out there, 12 miles away in terrain that could kill even experienced outdoorsmen, a woman was dying alone in the cold. He thought about the person he used to be, before Sarah's accident, before the guilt and fear drove him to this quiet corner of Montana. He'd been someone who ran toward emergencies, not away from them. Someone who had the skills and equipment to help people in situations exactly like this. The storm raged outside, but inside Max's chest, a different kind of storm was building. The careful walls he'd built around his old life were beginning to crack, and through those cracks, he could hear the echo of promises he'd made long ago, to Sarah, to himself, to the person he'd sworn he would always be. Max reached for his phone and dialed 911, knowing even as he did that the real decision wouldn't be made by emergency dispatch. It would be made by him, alone, in the next few minutes. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a tired voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? This is Max Palmer in Timber Ridge. I've received a distress call from a downed aircraft. Air Force captain, injured, located near Whitefish Lake. She needs immediate rescue. As he spoke the words, Max realized he was already committed to a course of action that would change everything. The question wasn't whether someone would attempt a rescue. The question was whether he had the courage to be that someone. The 911 dispatcher's response was exactly what Max had expected, but it still hit him like a physical blow. Sir, we've got multiple emergency calls tonight due to the storm. Highway 12 is completely impassable, and we have 3 separate vehicle accidents with people trapped. Our search and rescue team is already deployed, and we can't get aircraft in the air until this weather clears. Max closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness settle over him like a shroud. What's the earliest a rescue team could reach the Whitefish Lake area? Given current conditions, probably not until late morning at the earliest. More likely noon or later, depending on when the storm breaks. Noon. Captain Thorne wouldn't survive until noon. Max had enough experience with hypothermia to know that 12 hours was a death sentence in sub-zero temperatures, especially for someone who was already injured and exhausted. Sir? Are you still there? Yeah, I'm here. I'll monitor the situation and report any changes. Max hung up the phone and stared at it for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. The smart thing would be to do exactly what he'd told the dispatcher, monitor the situation. Stay safe, keep his daughter warm and protected. Let the professionals handle it when they could, but the smart thing wasn't always the right thing. Max had learned that lesson 3 years ago, on another night when the weather had turned deadly and someone he loved was beyond his reach. He walked to the window and looked out at the storm, but instead of seeing the swirling snow, he saw the Rain-soaked streets of Denver on a March evening that had changed everything. Sarah had been driving home from her book club meeting when the flash flood hit. The creek that ran parallel to Riverside Drive had overflowed its banks, turning the usually safe residential street into a raging torrent. Max had been 40 miles away, leading a technical rescue training session for Jefferson County Search and Rescue Team. He'd been teaching other volunteers how to navigate rope systems and confined spaces, how to reach people in impossible situations. The irony wasn't lost on him while he was teaching others to save lives, the most important. Life in his world was slipping away. Sarah's car had been swept off the road and pinned against a concrete bridge abutment. The water was rising fast and she was trapped, conscious but unable to escape. She'd managed to call 911, then him, her voice strangely calm as she described her situation. "I'm okay for now," she'd said. "The water's not too high yet." "But Max, I'm scared. I can't get the door open, and the windows won't break." Max had abandoned his training session immediately, speeding through the rain-slicked streets of Denver while coordinating with emergency services on his radio. He'd known every member of the rescue team responding to Sarah's accident, had trained most of them personally. They were good people, skilled professionals who would do everything possible to save her, but they'd arrived 6 minutes too late. The water had risen faster than anyone had predicted, and by the time the rescue team reached Sarah's car, she was gone. The same skills Max had spent years perfecting, the same techniques he'd taught countless others, couldn't save the person who mattered most. Max had quit search and rescue that night. He'd sold his house in Denver, packed up baby Sophie, and moved to Timber Ridge, where the only person he'd be responsible for saving was his daughter. He'd convinced himself that he was being practical, that Sophie needed a father who would be there for her, not one who was constantly running off to risk his life for strangers. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Max had lost his nerve. The man who had once rappelled down cliff faces to reach injured hikers, who had crawled through collapsed buildings to find survivors, who had never met a dangerous situation he wouldn't tackle head-on. That man had died with Sarah in the floodwaters. The emergency radio crackled, pulling Max back to the present. Captain Thorne's voice was barely audible now, weakened by cold and exhaustion. "Made it to the cabin," she whispered. No heat source door was locked, but broke. A window. Max keyed the microphone. "Captain, that's good. You're out of the wind. Look around for blankets, sleeping bags, anything that can help you retain body heat. Check the kitchen for food, and see if there's any kind of stove or fireplace. So cold," she replied. Hands not working right hard to hold the radio. Max's chest tightened. He'd seen hypothermia before, knew the progression of symptoms. Confusion, loss of fine motor control, eventually unconsciousness and death. Captain Thorne was already in the moderate stages, which meant she had hours at most before her condition became irreversible. He looked at Sophie, still sleeping peacefully in her fort. 3 years ago, he'd been away when Sarah needed him most. Now he was faced with the same impossible choice: stay with his daughter and let someone else die, or leave Sophie alone and risk everything to save a stranger. But this time was different. This time he was the only one who could help. Max walked to the basement, his feet carrying him to a corner he'd avoided for 3 years. Behind stacks of Sophie's outgrown clothes and boxes of Sarah's things, he found what he was looking for: a military surplus duffel bag containing his old search and rescue equipment. Rope, harnesses, emergency medical supplies, cold weather gear, and a dozen other items he'd once carried into dangerous situations without a second thought. He unzipped the bag and pulled out his old avalanche beacon, still in its protective case. The batteries were dead, but the backup power cell showed green. His hands moved automatically, checking each piece of equipment with the muscle memory of someone who had once trusted his life to these tools. The GPS unit was outdated, but functional. The headlamp still worked. The emergency bivouac sack was intact. Everything he needed to attempt a rescue was here, waiting for him to find the courage to use it. Max's hands closed around a photograph tucked into the bag's inner pocket. Sarah holding newborn Sophie, both of them smiling at the camera. On the back, in Sarah's neat handwriting, "To my hero, keep saving people. We'll be here when you get home." The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had known the risks of his volunteer work, had supported it anyway because she believed in what he was doing. She'd never asked him to choose between his family and his calling, had never made him feel guilty for the nights he spent away from home helping strangers. The choice to quit search and rescue had been his alone, driven by guilt and fear, rather than practical necessity. He'd told himself he was protecting Sophie, but the truth was that he was protecting himself from the possibility of failing someone again. Max looked at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully placed it back in the bag. He zipped up the duffel and carried it upstairs, where the emergency radio was broadcasting nothing but static. Captain Thorne's situation was deteriorating, and in a few hours, it would be too late to save her. Max had spent 3 years running from the person he used to be. Now, with a woman's life hanging in the balance and his daughter sleeping nearby, he had to decide, was he still the man Sarah had called her hero, or had that man died with her in the flood? The storm raged outside, but inside Max's chest, different kind of storm was building. The careful walls he'd built around his old life were beginning to crack, and through those cracks, he could hear the echo of promises he'd made long ago, to Sarah, to himself, to the person he'd sworn he would always be. He had a choice to make, and he had to make it now. Max stood in his living room, holding the photograph of Sarah and Sophie, when the emergency radio crackled one final time. Captain Thorne's voice was barely audible, a whisper so faint he had to strain to hear it. "Can't feel my hands anymore," she breathed. "Radio dying. If anyone can hear this, tell my sister. Elena in Portland, tell her I'm sorry I missed her wedding." The transmission cut to static, then silence. Max waited, adjusting the frequency, trying every channel, but Captain Thorne's radio had finally given out. She was alone now, 12 miles away in a freezing cabin, with no way to call for help and no way to know if anyone was coming. Max looked at the photograph one more time, then carefully placed it on the mantel next to a picture of Sophie on her first day of school. He walked to Sophie's blanket fort and knelt beside her sleeping form. In the soft glow of the emergency lantern, she looked impossibly small and vulnerable, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. "Sophie," he whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Sweetheart, wake up. I need to talk to you." Sophie's eyes fluttered open, confused and sleepy. "Dad, what's wrong? Is the power out?" "No, baby. The power's fine. Listen to me carefully, okay? I need to go help someone who's in trouble. A lady who got hurt in the storm." Sophie sat up, suddenly more alert. "Help someone? But it's still storming." "Outside. You said we should stay inside where it's safe." Max's heart clenched. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes staying safe meant letting someone die? How could he make her understand that the choice he was making wasn't about abandoning her, but about becoming the person she needed him to be? "You're right, it is dangerous out there," he said, sitting cross-legged beside her fort. "But sometimes when someone's life is in danger, we have to take risks to help them. Do you remember what I told you about your mom? About how she helped people even when it was hard?" Sophie nodded solemnly. She was a nurse. She helped sick people get better. "That's right. And she taught me that when we have the skills to help someone, we have a responsibility to use them. There's a lady out there who's very cold and very scared, and I might be the only person who can reach her in time." Sophie's eyes widened. "Are you going to save her like a superhero?" Max managed a small smile. "I'm not a superhero, kiddo. I'm just a dad who used to help people before you were born." But I'm going to try my best to bring her home safely. What about me? I can't come with you in the storm. No, you can't, but I'm going to call Mrs. Chun next door. She's probably awake anyway with all this wind, and she'll come stay with you until I get back. Sophie considered this, her young mind working through the implications. Mrs. Chun makes terrible hot chocolate. She uses water instead of milk. I know. But she tells good stories, and she'll keep you safe while I'm gone. Promise you'll come back? The question hit Max like a physical blow. He thought of Sarah, who had kissed him goodbye on the morning of her book club meeting, never imagining it would be their last conversation. He thought of all the promises that couldn't be kept, all the certainties that turned out to be illusions. I promise I'll do everything I can to come back to you, he said carefully. But Sophie, if something happens to me, you need to know that Mrs. Chun will take care of you, and your Aunt Lucy will come from Seattle. You'll never be alone, okay? Sophie nodded, her eyes serious. Are you scared? Max paused, considering whether to lie. But Sophie deserved honesty, even if it was frightening. Yeah, I'm scared. But sometimes we have to do things that scare us, because they're the right thing to do. Like when I had to get my shots at the doctor? Exactly like that. Sophie threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. I love you, Dad. Go save the lady. Max held her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the lingering sweetness of bedtime stories. This might be the last time he held his daughter, the last time he felt her small arms around his neck. But somehow, that possibility no longer paralyzed him. It clarified everything. He was Sophie's father, and being her father meant being someone worth looking up to. Someone who ran toward danger when others needed help. Someone who kept his promises, even when keeping them required everything he had. Max called Mrs. Chun, who answered on the first ring and agreed to come over immediately. While he waited, he methodically prepared his equipment. The old search and rescue gear felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend after years of absence. He checked the battery levels on his headlamp and GPS unit, packed emergency food and water, and filled his thermos with coffee that would help him stay alert during the long night ahead. From his closet, he pulled out gear he hadn't worn in 3 years. Insulated boots rated for sub-zero temperatures, a mountaineering jacket that had kept him warm on countless rescue missions, waterproof gloves that still had grip despite their age. As he dressed, Max felt something shifting inside him. A transformation that went deeper than just putting on old clothes. He was becoming himself again. Mrs. Chun arrived within 15 minutes, her gray hair protected by a rain bonnet and her arms full of knitting supplies. This is foolish, Max, she said without preamble. You have a daughter to think about. I'm thinking about her, Max replied, shouldering his pack. I'm thinking about the kind of man I want her to remember me as. Mrs. Chun studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your Sarah would be proud, she said quietly. She always said you were a hero, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Max felt tears prick his eyes. Take care of Sophie. If I'm not back by morning, you'll be back, Mrs. Chun interrupted firmly. Both of you will be back. I'll make real hot chocolate for everyone when you get home. Max kissed Sophie goodbye one more time, then stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical force, trying to drive him back toward the safety of his home. But he leaned into it, adjusting his pack and pulling his hood tight against the stinging snow. His truck was buried under 6 inches of snow, but the engine turned over on the second try. Max had installed snow tires and carried chains, had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency, even though he'd never imagined he'd be the one creating the emergency. As he drove slowly through the abandoned streets of Timber Ridge, Max thought about the route to Whitefish Lake. The main road would be impassable, but there was an old logging road that wound through the forest. Steep and dangerous, but potentially navigable with the right vehicle and enough determination. He thought about Captain Thorne, alone in a freezing cabin, her radio silent and her hopes fading. He thought about Sarah, who had faced her final moments with the same calm courage that had defined her entire life. He thought about Sophie, sleeping peacefully under Mrs. Chun's watchful eye, trusting that her father would come home safely. Max Palmer had spent 3 years running from the person he used to be. Tonight, in the fury of the worst storm in decades, he was running toward that person as fast as he could. The man Sarah had loved, the man Sophie needed him to be, the man who had once sworn to help others no matter the cost. The point of no return came when he turned off the main highway onto the narrow logging road. Behind him, the warm lights of Timber Ridge disappeared into the swirling snow. Ahead lay 12 miles of treacherous terrain, a dying woman, and a reckoning with the person he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Max pressed the accelerator and drove into the storm, carrying with him the desperate hope that 3 years of running away had finally taught him how to run toward something worth saving. The logging road disappeared beneath Max's truck within the first 2 miles. What had been a narrow but navigable track became a series of snow-filled ruts and fallen branches that tested every skill he'd learned during his years of backcountry rescues. The truck's headlights carved a weak tunnel through the driving snow, illuminating a world that seemed determined to swallow him whole. Max engaged the four-wheel drive and dropped into low gear, feeling the vehicle strain against the deepening snow. The GPS unit on his dashboard showed his position as a slow-moving dot crawling across a vast expanse of white, still 8 miles from Whitefish Lake. At this rate, it would take him another hour to reach the area where Captain Thorne had crash-landed, if he could reach it at all. A massive pine tree blocked the road ahead, its trunk easily 3 feet in diameter. Max stopped the truck and stepped out into the storm, immediately feeling the wind try to knock him sideways. The tree had fallen recently, probably within the last hour, its branches still green and flexible. There was no way around it, and no way to move it without heavy equipment, but Max had spent years dealing with obstacles like this. He returned to the truck and pulled out his chainsaw, a tool he'd carried on dozens of rescue missions. The engine fired up on the 3rd pull, its angry buzz almost lost in the wind. Working by headlamp, Max cut through the trunk in sections, each piece heavy enough to require all his strength to drag clear of the road. By the time he'd cleared a path, 30 precious minutes had passed. Max was sweating inside his cold weather gear, his muscles already fatigued from the physical effort. But he was making progress, moving closer to someone who was counting on him to reach her in time. The next 4 miles were a nightmare of switchbacks and washouts. Twice, the truck's rear wheels spun uselessly in hidden ice, forcing Max to get out and put chains on the tires. His hands were numb despite his insulated gloves, and his face felt raw from the wind-driven snow. But he kept moving forward, 1 careful mile at a time. The truck's temperature gauge began climbing into the danger zone as the engine worked harder and harder against the conditions. Max knew he was pushing the vehicle beyond its limits, but he also knew that turning back now would mean Captain Thorne's death. He pressed on, speaking quiet words of encouragement to his truck, as if it were a rescue dog straining against impossible odds. At 2:17 a.m., Max finally reached the valley that contained Whitefish Lake. The frozen lake stretched out before him, a flat expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees along its shores. Somewhere in this wilderness, an Air Force pilot was fighting for her life in a cabin that might not even exist. Max parked the truck as close to the lake as possible and switched to his handheld GPS unit. According to Captain Thorne's last transmission, she was near a cell tower with a red blinking light. Max scanned the surrounding ridges until he spotted it, a faint red glow about a mile to the northeast, barely visible through the storm. He shouldered his pack and began hiking through snow that was knee-deep in places. The GPS unit guided him toward the cell tower, but finding the cabin would require more than electronic navigation. Max had to think like the pilot who had crashed here, had to understand what landmarks she would have seen in the darkness and confusion following her emergency landing. The aircraft wreckage appeared suddenly, a dark scar against the white landscape. Max's headlamp revealed the twisted remains of what had once been a small single-engine plane. Its wings sheared off and its fuselage crumpled against a cluster of boulders. The fact that anyone had survived this crash was a miracle in itself. Max examined the wreckage quickly, looking for signs of the pilot's escape route. He found a trail of disturbed snow leading away from the crash site, punctuated by what looked like blood drops already being covered by fresh snowfall. The trail led toward a stand of pine trees about 100 yards away. The cabin materialized out of the storm like something from a nightmare. It was smaller than Max had expected, little more than a hunting shack with a metal roof and walls of weathered logs. One of the windows had been broken, and a faint yellow glow leaked through the opening. The light from Captain Thorne's emergency flashlight. Max approached the cabin cautiously, announcing himself before he reached the door. "Captain Thorne, this is Max Palmer. I'm here to help you." No response. Max pushed through the broken window and swept the interior with his headlamp. The cabin was a single room with a wood stove, a few pieces of rustic furniture, and shelves lined with canned goods and emergency supplies. And there, huddled in the corner wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket, was Captain Kira Thorne. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her lips were blue, and her skin had the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia. Max knelt beside her and checked her pulse, weak but steady. She was alive, but barely. "Captain Thorne," Max said, gently shaking her shoulder. "Can you hear me? I'm here to get you out of this." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Who?" She whispered, "I'm Max Palmer. I heard your radio transmission. You're going to be okay." Max quickly assessed her condition. Hypothermia, obviously, but also a head injury that had left dried blood on her temple. Her left arm was cradled against her chest, possibly broken. She needed immediate medical attention, but more importantly, she needed to get warm. Max's training kicked in automatically. He found dry wood stacked beside the stove and quickly built a fire, coaxing the flames to life with paper and kindling. The cabin began to warm almost immediately, and Captain Thorne's breathing became slightly less labored. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," Max said, pulling emergency blankets from his pack. "I'm going to preserve your dignity as much as possible, but your survival depends on getting warm." Working quickly but carefully, Max helped Captain Thorne out of her flight suit and into dry thermal underwear from his emergency kit. He wrapped her in space blankets and positioned her near the fire, then began heating water on the wood stove. "What's your name?" Max asked, trying to keep her conscious. "Kira," she managed. "Captain Kira Thorne." "How long have you been here, Kira?" "Don't know. Hours. Radio died. Thought I was going to ... She didn't finish the sentence. Max prepared a warm drink from his supplies, something with sugar and electrolytes that would help her body begin to recover. "You're not going to die. Not on my watch." But even as he spoke the words, Max knew that getting Captain Thorne warm was only the first challenge. The storm was still raging outside, and the trek back to his truck would be treacherous, even for someone in perfect health. Captain Thorne was injured, weak, and barely conscious. Moving her in these conditions could kill her just as surely as leaving her in the cabin. Max looked at his watch. 3:45 a.m. He'd been away from Sophie for over 3 hours, and the most dangerous part of the rescue was still ahead of him. He thought about his daughter, safely asleep under Mrs. Chun's care, and about the promise he'd made to come home, but he also thought about the woman sitting beside him, an Air Force pilot who had served her country and deserved to see another sunrise. The same instinct that had driven him to become a search and rescue volunteer years ago, the same calling that had made Sarah fall in love with him, was fully awakened now that Max Palmer had found Captain Kira Thorne. Now he had to find a way to get them both home alive. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the drama playing out in the small cabin. But inside, warmed by fire and human determination, two strangers began the delicate process of survival. One careful decision at a time. Max spent the next hour carefully monitoring Captain Thorne's condition while formulating a plan that wouldn't kill them both. The cabin's warmth had brought some color back to her face, and her breathing had steadied, but she was still weak and disoriented. Moving her through the storm would be dangerous, but staying in the cabin until the weather cleared wasn't an option. She needed medical attention that Max couldn't provide. "Kira," Max said gently, kneeling beside her. "I need you to stay awake and talk to me. Can you tell me about your injuries?" She blinked slowly, focusing on his face with visible effort. "Head hit something during the crash. Left arm, I think. It's broken, and I can't feel my toes." Max examined her more thoroughly, his emergency medical training guiding his assessment. The head injury didn't appear to be severe, no signs of concussion beyond the initial confusion. The broken arm was a clean fracture that he could immobilize. The numbness in her feet was concerning, but not immediately life-threatening. "I'm going to make a makeshift stretcher," Max explained, pulling rope and emergency blankets from his pack. "We need to get you to a hospital, but I can't carry you a mile through this snow." Using materials from the cabin, 2 wooden chairs and rope from his pack, Max constructed a sled that would allow him to pull Captain Thorne through the snow. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. He lined it with every blanket and cushion he could find, creating a cocoon that would protect her from the wind and cold. "This is going to be uncomfortable," Max warned as he helped her onto the improvised stretcher. "But it's our best shot at getting you out of here alive." Captain Thorne managed a weak smile. "I've had worse flights." The journey back to the truck was a test of endurance that pushed Max beyond anything he'd experienced in his years of search and rescue. The sled moved easily enough across the snow, but controlling it on the uneven terrain required constant attention. Every bump and depression threatened to upset the delicate balance, and Max had to move slowly enough to avoid jarring Captain Thorne's injuries while still making progress through the storm. The wind seemed to fight them every step of the way. Max's headlamp created a narrow tunnel of visibility, but beyond that circle of light, the world was a swirling chaos of snow and shadows. He navigated by GPS and instinct, following the trail he'd made on his way in, now partially filled with fresh snow. Halfway back to the truck, Captain Thorne began to shiver violently, a good sign that her body was warming up and regaining normal function. Max stopped to check on her, adjusting the blankets and giving her sips of warm tea from his thermos. "You're doing great," he told her, though he was breathing hard from the exertion. "We're almost there." "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why did you come out here? You don't even know me." Max was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because someone needed help, and I had the skills to provide it. And because I made a promise to myself a long time ago." "What kind of promise?" "To never let fear stop me from doing what's right." The truck appeared through the storm like a beacon of hope, its red paint barely visible under the accumulated snow. Max had never been so happy to see a vehicle in his life. He carefully transferred Captain Thorne from the sled to the truck's cab, cranking the heat to maximum and wrapping her in additional blankets. "Stay with me, Kira," Max said as he started the engine. "We're going to get you to a hospital." The drive back down the mountain was even more treacherous than the ascent. The truck's engine was running hot, and Max could hear concerning noises from the transmission. But the vehicle held together, carrying them slowly but steadily toward Timber Ridge and the medical help Captain Thorne desperately needed. By the time they reached the main highway, the storm was beginning to weaken. The Snow was still falling, but the wind had died down and visibility had improved dramatically. Max felt a surge of relief as he turned onto the paved road that would take them to St. Mary's Hospital, 20 miles south of Timber Ridge. "Max," Captain Thorne said weakly from the passenger seat, "I need to tell you something. Save your strength. We're almost there. No, this is important. I wasn't on a routine flight when I crashed. I was being transferred to a new assignment. Emergency orders came through yesterday, and I was supposed to report to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs." Max glanced at her, puzzled. "Okay, we'll make sure they know where you are. You don't understand. The assignment. It's not what you think. I'm not just a pilot. I'm a flight surgeon. I was being transferred to lead a new medical evacuation unit." Max felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "A doctor?" "Yes, and when I heard your voice on the radio, the way you handled the emergency, the questions you asked. You're not just a carpenter, are you? You have medical training." Max was quiet for a long moment. "I used to be a paramedic. Before I moved to Timber Ridge." "I thought so. You knew exactly what to do for hypothermia, how to assess my injuries, how to move me safely. That's not common knowledge." The hospital came into view, its emergency entrance brightly lit against the gray dawn. Max pulled up to the doors and immediately called for help. Within minutes, medical staff had transferred Captain Thorne to a gurney and wheeled her inside, where she would receive the definitive care she needed. Max stood in the parking lot, watching the automatic doors close behind her, feeling the strange emptiness that always followed the completion of a rescue. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted and oddly deflated. He'd done what he'd set out to do. Captain Thorne was alive and in good hands. But something about their conversation in the truck had unsettled him. A flight surgeon, a doctor who specialized in emergency medicine, being transferred to lead a medical evacuation unit. Max pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the immediate relief of having completed the rescue successfully. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chun. "Sophie is fine, sleeping peacefully. Take your time." Max smiled, feeling the weight of the night's events settling over him like a blanket. He'd kept his promise to his daughter, and he'd saved a life in the process. The man Sarah had fallen in love with, the man who had once made saving people his calling, was still there beneath the careful walls he'd built around his heart. As he drove home through the quieting storm, Max thought about the conversation he'd had with Captain Thorne. There had been something in her voice when she'd talked about her new assignment, something that suggested their paths might cross again. But he was too tired to puzzle it out now. All that mattered was that Kira Thorne was alive, Sophie was safe, and he'd proven to himself that 3 years of running away hadn't destroyed the person he'd always been meant to be. The immediate crisis was over. The rescue was complete. But as Max would soon discover, saving Captain Thorne's life was only the beginning of a story that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. 3 days after the rescue, Max stood in the doorway of Captain Thorne's hospital room, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that Sophie had insisted on picking from their greenhouse. The flowers looked slightly wilted after the drive to the hospital, but Sophie had been adamant that the lady pilot needed something cheerful to look at. "Dad, are you going to stand there all day?" Sophie whispered loudly, tugging on his jacket. "She's awake. I can see her looking at us." Max smiled despite his nervousness. He'd been putting off this visit for 2 days, unsure why he felt so anxious about seeing Captain Thorne again. During the rescue, everything had been focused on survival. Now in the sterile calm of the hospital, he wasn't sure what to say to the woman whose life he'd saved. "Knock, knock," he said softly, stepping into the room. "I hope we're not disturbing you." Captain Kira Thorne was sitting up in bed, her left arm in a sling, but her color much improved from the pale, hypothermic woman he'd found in the cabin. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup, but her eyes were alert and warm as she smiled at them. "Max," she said, her voice stronger than it had been during the rescue, "I was hoping you'd come by. And you must be Sophie." Sophie stepped forward with the confidence that only 8-year-olds possess. "I brought you flowers. Dad said you might like them because hospitals are boring and don't have enough color." Kira accepted the bouquet with genuine delight. "There. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Would you like to sit down? I've been hoping to meet the famous Sophie I've heard so much about." Max raised an eyebrow. "You've heard about Sophie? The nurses told me you kept talking about her during the rescue. How you needed to get back to her. How proud you were of her. It was clear she was your whole world." Sophie climbed into the chair beside the bed, clearly pleased by the attention. "Dad was really brave. He went out in the storm even though it was dangerous. Mrs. Chun said he was like a hero in a movie." "Mrs. Chun was right," Kira said, looking at Max with an expression that made him uncomfortable in the best possible way. "Your father saved my life. I wouldn't be here without him." Max felt heat rise to his cheeks. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Kira said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary. The doctors told me about your improvised stretcher, how you managed my hypothermia treatment, how you navigated 12 miles through a blizzard. That's not something anyone could have done." For the next hour, they talked easily, the conversation flowing in directions Max hadn't expected. Kira asked Sophie about school, her friends, her favorite books. Sophie, delighted to have such an attentive audience, told elaborate stories about her art projects and her plans to become either a veterinarian or a professional fort builder. "What about you, Max?" Kira asked during a lull in Sophie's chatter. "Sophie tells me you're a carpenter, but I suspect there's more to the story." Max glanced at his daughter, who was now arranging the wildflowers in a water pitcher she'd found on the bedside table. "I used to be a paramedic. Did search and rescue work in Colorado before we moved to Montana." "What made you change careers?" The question hung in the air between them. Max found himself wanting to tell her the truth, something about Kira's direct gaze and genuine interest making him want to be honest in a way he rarely was with strangers. "I lost someone," he said quietly. "My wife, Sarah. She died in an accident while I was away on a rescue mission. I couldn't save her, and I couldn't keep doing the work after that." Kira's expression softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was. But the other night, when I heard your voice on the radio, I remembered why I used to do that work, why it mattered. And now?" Max looked at Sophie, who was humming softly as she arranged flowers. "Now I'm wondering if maybe it's time to stop running from who I used to be." Kira studied his face for a long moment. "Can I tell you something? About why I was flying that night?" Max nodded, settling back in his chair. "I wasn't just being transferred to a new base. I was running away from something, too. I'd been working in a trauma center in San Antonio, and we lost a patient, a young airman, barely 19. I made a mistake during the surgery, nothing that would have changed the outcome, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. When the transfer orders came through, I jumped at the chance to leave. And now?" Kira smiled, echoing his earlier question. "Now I'm wondering if maybe we both needed to end up in that cabin, in that storm, to remember who we're supposed to be." Sophie looked up from her flower arrangement. "Are you going to stay in Montana now? We could show you all the best hiking trails, and Dad makes really good pancakes on Sundays." Kira laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "I'd love that, but I have to report to my new assignment in Colorado Springs. The Air Force doesn't give you much choice about where you go." "When do you have to leave?" Max asked, surprised by how disappointed he felt. "The doctors say I can be discharged tomorrow. I'm supposed to report to Peterson Air Force Base by the end of the week." Sophie frowned. "But that's not fair. You just got here." "Life isn't always fair, sweetheart," Kira said gently. But sometimes the unfair parts lead to the best surprises. That evening, after they'd returned home and Sophie had gone to bed, Max found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening routine. He kept thinking about his conversation with Kira, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd talked about Sarah, about the easy way she'd connected with Sophie the next morning. He drove to the hospital to check on her discharge, telling himself he was just being polite. He found her in the lobby, signing paperwork at the discharge desk, wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater that made her look younger and less formal than she had in her hospital gown. "Max," she said, looking up with surprise and obvious pleasure. "I didn't expect to see you again. I wanted to make sure you got discharged okay. And to return this." He handed her a small bag containing her personal effects that had been in his truck, her flight helmet, some papers from her aircraft, and a small photograph that had fallen out of her flight suit. Kira looked through the bag, then held up the photograph. "This is my sister Elena. She just got married last month. I was supposed to be her maid of honor, but I was deployed overseas. I kept her picture in my flight suit because ... She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Because I thought it might be the last time I saw her face if something happened to me." Max understood that feeling, the weight of carrying someone's image as a talisman against the possibility of never seeing them again. "She's beautiful. She looks like you. People say that. We're very close, or we were before I started moving around so much with the military. The wedding it was hard, missing it. I've missed a lot of family events over the years." They walked together toward the hospital exit, neither seeming eager to say goodbye. The Montana sunshine felt warm after the sterile air conditioning of the hospital, and Max found himself looking for reasons to extend their time together. "Have you eaten breakfast?" he asked. "There's a good diner in town. Nothing fancy, but they make decent coffee." Kira checked her watch. "I don't have to catch my flight until this afternoon. Breakfast sounds perfect." The Red Pine Diner was exactly the kind of place Max had hoped it would be. Comfortable, unpretentious, with red vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone Hun. They ordered coffee and pancakes, and Max found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. "Tell me about Sophie's mother," Kira said gently. "If you don't mind talking about her." Max stirred his coffee, considering how to sum up the woman who had been his entire world for 6 years. Sarah she was the kind of person who made everyone around her better. She was a pediatric nurse, and she had this way of making scared kids feel safe just by being in the room with them. She laughed at terrible jokes, she sang in the shower, and she never met a stray animal she didn't want to adopt. "She sounds wonderful." She was. And she believed in the work I was doing, even when it meant I was away from home more than either of us liked. She used to say that loving someone meant supporting their calling, even when it was inconvenient. Kira was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she'd want you to give up that calling because of what happened to her?" The question hit Max like a physical blow. He'd asked himself the same thing hundreds of times over the past 3 years, but hearing it from someone else made it impossible to avoid. "No," he said quietly. "She'd probably be furious with me for hiding out in Montana instead of helping people. Maybe that's why the storm brought us together," Kira said. "Maybe she's still looking out for you, making sure you find your way back to who you're supposed to be." Max looked across the table at this woman who had crashed into his life, literally, and somehow understood him in a way that felt both startling and natural. "What about you? What would the person you used to be think about you running away to Colorado?" Kira smiled ruefully. "She'd probably say I was being a coward, that one mistake doesn't define a career, and that there are people who need help more than I need to feel sorry for myself. So what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet. But I'm starting to think that maybe running away isn't the answer for either of us." They talked until Kira's flight departure time made it impossible to delay any longer. Max drove her to the small regional airport, both of them quiet during the drive. At the departure gate, they stood facing each other, neither quite sure how to say goodbye. "Thank you," Kira said finally. "For saving my life, yes, but also for reminding me who I used to be. Who I still am, underneath all the doubt and fear." "Thank you for the same thing," Max replied. "And for showing me that it's possible to be brave again." Kira hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "This has my contact information. I know we're both figuring things out, but maybe we could stay in touch." Max took the card, their fingers brushing briefly. "I'd like that." As her flight was called, Kira stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a gesture that was friendly but carried the promise of something more. "Take care of yourself, Max Palmer, and take care of that amazing daughter of yours." Max watched her disappear through the security checkpoint, feeling something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the sense that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He had no idea that change would come sooner than he expected, or that Kira Thorne's emergency orders would soon turn both their worlds upside down. But for now, it was enough to know that the storm had brought them together, that they'd found something worth holding on to, and that sometimes the best rescues were the ones that saved both the rescuer and the rescued. 2 weeks after Kira's departure, Max found himself standing in the doorway of his old workshop, but this time he wasn't looking at carpentry projects. Spread across his workbench were maps of the Montana wilderness, emergency medical supplies he'd ordered online, and a stack of paperwork from the county sheriff's office. "Dad, why are you organizing all that rescue stuff again?" Sophie asked, appearing beside him with a piece of toast in one hand and a curious expression on her face. Max smiled, ruffling her hair. "Because I think it's time I stopped hiding from who I used to be. Sheriff Martinez called yesterday. They want to restart the volunteer search and rescue program. They need someone with experience to lead it." "Does that mean you're going? To help people again, like you helped the pilot lady?" "Yes, sweetheart. It means I'm going to help people again." Sophie considered this for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good. Mom would have liked that." The simple statement hit Max squarely in the chest. In the past 2 weeks, he'd been thinking a lot about Sarah, about what she would want for him and Sophie. The conversations with Kira had awakened something in him, not just the desire to help others, but the understanding that honoring Sarah's memory meant living fully, not hiding from life. He'd been exchanging emails with Kira almost daily since she'd left Montana. Their correspondence had started with simple updates. She'd arrived safely at Peterson Air Force Base, was settling into her new assignment, missed the mountain air. But gradually, their messages had become longer, more personal, filled with the kind of intimate details that people share when they're falling in love, but haven't quite admitted it yet. Kira had written about her work establishing the new medical evacuation unit, about the challenges of military bureaucracy, about her sister Alana's reaction to hearing about the rescue. Max had shared stories about Sophie's latest art projects, about his decision to rejoin search and rescue, about the way the Montana landscape looked different now that he was seeing it through the eyes of someone who wanted to engage with the world again. "Mr. Palmer?" A voice from the driveway interrupted his thoughts. Max looked up to see a young man in military dress uniform walking toward the workshop, carrying an official-looking envelope. "That's me," Max said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Staff Sergeant Williams, Peterson Air Force Base. I have a delivery for you, sir, from Captain Thorne." Max accepted the envelope, puzzled. "She sent something through official channels?" "Yes, sir. She said it was important and couldn't wait for regular mail." After the sergeant left, Max stared at the envelope. It was thick, formal, with official Air Force letterhead. Through the window, he could see Sophie playing in the yard with Mrs. Chun's dog, her laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. Max opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a formal letter on Air Force letterhead, along with a handwritten note from Kira and several other documents. He read the handwritten note first. Max, I don't know how to prepare you for what you're about to read. These orders came through 2 days ago, and I've been staring at them ever since, wondering if this is coincidence or fate or something else entirely. I wanted to call you, but I thought you should see this in writing first, read the official letter. Then call me. Please. Everything is about to change. Kira. Max's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the official document. At the top in bold letters was the heading, Classified Personnel Requisition, Civilian Contractor Emergency Medical Services. He read the letter once, then twice, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Mr. Maxwell Palmer, based on recommendations from Captain Kira Thorne, MD, and review of your military service record and civilian emergency medical credentials, you are hereby requested to consider employment as a civilian contractor for the newly established High-Risk Medical Evacuation Unit, Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado Springs, Colorado. This unit specializes in rescue operations in extreme terrain and weather conditions where traditional military assets cannot operate effectively. Your unique combination of paramedic certification, technical rescue experience, and demonstrated competence in high-risk wilderness operations makes you an ideal candidate for this position. Captain Thorne has provided detailed reports of your actions during the emergency rescue conducted on date, including your improvised medical treatment, terrain navigation, and decision-making under extreme stress. Her assessment indicates that you possess exactly the skill set we require for this specialized unit. This position offers competitive salary commensurate with experience, full medical and dental benefits, housing allowance for military family, housing, opportunity to serve alongside elite military medical personnel, deployment schedule allowing for significant family time. Should you accept this position, you would be working directly under Captain Thorne's command, training civilian and military personnel in wilderness medical evacuation techniques. Your expertise would be instrumental in saving lives in situations where conventional rescue operations are impossible. Please review the attached job description and benefits package. If you are interested in this opportunity, please contact Captain Thorne at the number provided within 72 hours. Respectfully, Colonel Janet Hayes, Commander High-Risk Medical Evacuation Unit. Max sat down heavily on his workbench, the letter still in his hands. The attachment included a detailed job description that read like someone had written it specifically for him. Wilderness medical training, technical rescue instruction, high-altitude operations, extreme weather response. His phone was ringing. Before he realized he'd dialed Kira's number. Max, her voice was breathless, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. Kira, what? How did this happen? I didn't plan it, she said quickly. I swear I didn't. When I got to Peterson, they told me about this new unit they were creating, and they asked about my experience with wilderness medicine. I mentioned the rescue, and they wanted to know more. Then they asked if I knew anyone with the right civilian credentials, and you recommended me. I told them about you, about your background, your skills, what you did that night in the storm. Max, they've been looking for someone like you for months. The military has plenty of flight surgeons, but they need someone who understands civilian emergency response, someone who can operate independently in impossible conditions. Max was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Working under your command? Yes, Max, I know this is complicated. I know whatever we are to each other, it would make things difficult. But you're the best person for this job. You're the only person I've ever seen who could have done what you did that night. What about Sophie? I can't uproot her life just because. There's family housing on base, good schools, and the deployment schedule is designed for people with families. You'd be home most of the time, training and preparing. The actual rescue missions would be occasional, maybe once a month. Max looked out the window at Sophie, who was now helping Mrs. Chen plant flowers in the garden. His daughter was resilient, adaptable, but she'd already lost one parent. Could he ask her to leave the only stable home she'd ever known? "I need time to think about this," he said. "Of course. But Max, there's something else. Something I haven't told you." "What?" "The unit isn't just about rescue operations. They want to create a training program for civilian first responders, teaching them how to work with military assets during large-scale emergencies. Natural disasters, mass casualties, situations where military and civilian resources need to coordinate." Max felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of training?" "The kind you used to do in Colorado, but bigger. They want to create a national program, training civilian search and rescue teams across the western United States. You wouldn't just be doing rescues, Max. You'd be building something that could save hundreds of lives." The scope of what she was describing was staggering. Max had always believed that the gap between military and civilian emergency response was one of the biggest problems in disaster management. The military had resources and discipline. Civilians had local knowledge and community connections. A program that bridged that gap could revolutionize emergency response. "Who else knows about this position?" he asked. "Right now, just the people who need to know. Colonel Hayes, me, and a few others. But Max, they're not going to wait long. If you don't take this job, they'll find someone else, and that someone else won't be you." Max closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling over him. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a carpenter hiding from his past. Now he was being offered the chance to return to his calling in a way that was bigger and more meaningful than anything he'd ever imagined. "I need to talk to Sophie," he said. "I understand. But Max, whatever you decide, I want you to know that recommending you wasn't about us. It wasn't about trying to get you to move to Colorado. It was about putting the right person in a position where they could save lives. I know that. And Kira, whatever I decide, I want you to know that these past weeks, getting to know you, remembering who I used to be, it's changed everything for me. Whether I take this job or not, you've already given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope, and the belief that it's possible to move forward without leaving the past behind. That evening, Max sat Sophie down for what he knew would be one of the most important conversations of their lives. He'd prepared what he thought was a careful, logical explanation of the opportunity, but Sophie listened with the intensity of someone much older than her 8 years. "So the pilot lady wants you to come work with her?" Sophie asked when he'd finished. "Yes, but only if you're okay with it. Only if you think it's something we should do together." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Would we live near her?" "Yes, we would." "Would you be helping people like you helped her?" "Yes." "And would you be happy?" The question caught Max off guard. "What do you mean?" "Would you be happy like you used to be with Mom? Before you got sad? And we moved here?" Max felt tears prick his eyes. "I think I would be, sweetheart. I think I would be very happy." Sophie nodded decisively. "Then we should go. Because Mrs. Chun says that when grown-ups are happy, kids are happy too. And because I liked the pilot lady, she seemed nice. Her name is Kira, I know. I like her name too." Max pulled Sophie into his arms, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of his daughter's response. "Are you sure? It would mean leaving Montana, leaving Mrs. Chun, starting over. In a new place. Dad, we started over before. We can do it again. Besides, Mrs. Chun is old. She might want to visit us in Colorado and see what mountains look like when they're not covered in snow." Max laughed, amazed by his daughter's capacity for adaptation and optimism. "You're right, she might. So we're going to do it?" Max looked around their small living room, at the life they'd built in Timber Ridge, at the careful safety they'd constructed after Sarah's death. It was a good life, but it wasn't the life he was meant to live. It wasn't the life Sarah would have wanted for them. "Yes," he said, "we're going to do it." Sophie cheered and threw her arms around his neck. "This is going to be the best adventure ever." As Max held his daughter, he thought about the phone call he would make to Kira, about the new life they were about to begin, about the possibility that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to embrace the future with open arms. The storm that had brought Kira into his life had done more than just test his courage. It had awakened his heart to possibilities he'd never imagined. And now, with emergency orders that seemed designed by fate itself, those possibilities were about to become reality. 6 months later, Max stood at the edge of the training field at Peterson Air Force Base, watching as a team of civilian search and rescue volunteers practiced coordinating with military helicopter crews. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado landscape, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. "Radio check, Ground Team Alpha," came the voice through his headset. "We have visual on the simulated casualties. Requesting medical evacuation support." Max keyed his radio. "Ground Team Alpha, this is Base Command. Medical evacuation helicopter is 2 minutes out. Prepare your landing zone and have patient reports ready for the flight surgeon." He watched with pride as the civilian team executed a flawless coordination with the approaching military helicopter. These volunteers had come from search and rescue units across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, spending 2 weeks learning to work seamlessly with military assets during large-scale emergencies. "Looking good out there," came a familiar voice from behind him. Max turned to see Kira approaching, wearing her flight suit and carrying a medical bag. Even after 6 months of working together, the sight of her still made his heart skip slightly. "The Montana team is particularly impressive," Max said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the landing zone. "They've got that mountain instinct you can't teach." "They learned from the best," Hero replied, bumping his shoulder playfully. "Their instructor has some experience with impossible rescues in terrible weather." Max smiled. The teasing had become comfortable between them, a way of acknowledging their shared history while maintaining the professional relationship that their work demanded. It wasn't always easy, working together while navigating the growing feelings between them, but they'd found a rhythm that worked. "How's Sophie adjusting to her new school?" Kira asked as they reached the medical station. "Better than I expected. She's made friends with 3 kids in her class, and she's joined the art club. Yesterday she informed me that Colorado mountains are more dramatic than Montana mountains, which I think means she approves of the move." "And her teacher?" "Mrs. Rodriguez says Sophie's reading level is advanced for her age, and she's been helping some of the other kids with their art projects. She's thriving." Max had been amazed by Sophie's resilience during the transition. Moving from their quiet life in Timber Ridge to a bustling military base community could have been traumatic, but Sophie had embraced the change with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else in her life. She'd made friends quickly, adapted to her new school, and had even started calling Kira by her first name instead of Captain Thorne. The helicopter touched down with precision, and Max watched as the training exercise continued. The civilian team transferred their simulated casualties to the military medical crew, with Kira serving as the flight surgeon who would oversee their care during transport. It was a beautiful example of the kind of coordination that the program was designed to foster. "Ground Team Alpha, excellent work," Max radioed. "Debrief in Conference Room B in 30 minutes. As the helicopter lifted off and the training exercise concluded, Max felt the familiar satisfaction that came from seeing people learn skills that could save lives. This was what he'd been meant to do, not just rescue people himself, but teach others how to be rescuers. "Sir," a young airman approached with a clipboard. "Colonel Hayes would like to see you in her office when you're free." Max nodded and headed toward the command building. Colonel Hayes had been instrumental in creating the high-risk medical evacuation unit, and her support had been crucial in making the civilian military training program a reality. "Max, come in," Colonel Hayes sighed, looking up from her desk. "I wanted to give you an update on the program evaluation." Max took a seat across from her, noting the satisfied expression on her face. "Good news, I hope. Better than good. The preliminary results from the program assessment are exceptional. The civilian teams that have completed our training are showing 40% improvement in coordination efficiency during joint operations, and their success rate in simulated large-scale emergencies has increased by 60%. Max felt a surge of pride. "That's incredible." "It gets better. The Pentagon wants to expand the program nationally. They're requesting a proposal for training centers in 5 additional regions, with you as the lead developer for the curriculum." Max blinked, stunned. "National expansion?" "Max, what you and Captain Thorne have built here is exactly what the country needs. The gap between civilian and military emergency response has been a problem for decades, and you've created a solution that actually works." "What would national expansion mean?" "It would mean travel to establish new training centers, working with regional emergency management agencies, and building a network of coordinators who can maintain the program standards. It would also mean a significant promotion and salary increase, along with more flexibility in your schedule." Max thought about the implications. National expansion would mean their work could impact emergency response across the entire country. It would also mean more time away from Sophie, at least initially. "I'll need to discuss this with my daughter," Max said. "And with Captain Thorne. Of course, take your time to consider it. The Pentagon isn't expecting an answer immediately." As Max left the colonel's office, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been hiding from his calling, afraid to risk failing someone again. Now he was being offered the chance to impact emergency response on a national scale. He found Kira in the medical facility, updating training records from the day's exercises. She looked up as he entered, and he could see the question in her eyes. "Big news?" she asked. "The Pentagon wants to expand the program nationally. 5 new training centers with me as the lead developer." Kira's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Max, that's incredible. This program could change everything about how we handle large-scale emergencies. It would mean a lot of travel at least initially, but think about the impact. Every civilian search and rescue team in the country could have access to this training. The lives we could save." Max sat down beside her, struck by how naturally she'd said "we." Over the past 6 months, they'd become true partners in the work, each bringing their unique expertise to create something neither could have built alone. "What about us?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. They'd been careful to maintain professional boundaries, but the attraction and emotional connection between them had only grown stronger. They'd shared dinners, Sophie's soccer games, quiet conversations about their hopes and fears, but they'd never officially acknowledged what was developing between them. "What about us?" Kira echoed, her voice soft. "I mean, if I'm traveling to establish new training centers, if the program keeps growing, what happens to this?" He gestured between them. "Them." Kira was quiet for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. "Max, I care about you. I care about Sophie. But I also care about the work we're doing together. We're building something that matters, something that could save thousands of lives. And I think we're strong enough to figure out the personal stuff as we go. I think what we have is worth fighting for, whether that's the program or ... double quotes." She paused, then smiled. "Or whatever this is between us." Max squeezed her hand. "I think so too." That evening, Max sat with Sophie in their small on-base apartment, explaining the opportunity for national expansion. She listened with the same serious attention she'd given to their conversation about moving to Colorado. "So you'd be traveling to different places, teaching people how to save other people?" Sophie asked. Yes, but I'd be home most of the time. The travel would be temporary, just while we're setting up the new centers. And Miss Kira would be here? Yes, she'd be here, managing the program from this base. Sophie considered this. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you love Miss Kira? The question caught Max off guard. Sophie, that's complicated. No, it's not. Do you love her? Max looked at his daughter, struck by her directness. Yes, I think I do. Does she love you? I don't know. I hope so. Sophie nodded matter-of-factly. She does. I can tell by the way she looks at you when you're not looking at her, and by the way she always asks about me when she calls. Max smiled at his daughter's perceptiveness. You're very observant. I'm not dumb, Dad. I know when grown-ups like each other. So are you going to marry her? Sophie, we haven't even talked about, but you want to, right? Max paused, considering his answer. Yes, I think I do. But these things take time, sweetheart. People need to figure things out. Well, maybe you should figure it out faster. Because I like her, and I think she'd be a good mom. Not like my real mom, but like a bonus mom. Max felt his eyes fill with tears. A bonus mom? Yeah, someone who loves you and loves me and makes pancakes almost as good as you do. Does Kira make pancakes? I don't know yet, but I'm pretty sure she could learn. Max laughed, amazed once again by his daughter's wisdom and resilience. You know what, Sophie? I think you're right about a lot of things. I know I am. So you're going to take the job? Yes, I think I am. Good, because helping people is what you do best, and now you get to teach other people how to help people too. It's like ... like making helpers out of helpers. Max hugged his daughter tightly. That's exactly what it is. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Max called Kira. I'm going to take the job, he said without preamble. That's wonderful, Max. This program is going to change everything. Kira, can I ask you something? Of course. When this program expands nationally, when it becomes everything we've been working toward, what happens to us? There was a pause. Then Kira's voice came through the phone, warm and certain. I think we figure it out together. I think we build something beautiful, both professionally and personally. And I think we do it one day at a time, just like we've been doing. I love you, Max said, the words coming out before he could stop them. I love you too, Kira replied without hesitation. I have for months. I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it. Max felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. I'm ready. For all of it. The job, the expansion, building something together. And Sophie? Sophie informed me tonight that you'd make a good bonus mom, assuming you can learn to make pancakes. Kira laughed. I'll start practicing tomorrow. As Max hung up the phone, he looked around the small apartment that had become home. In 6 months, they'd built something extraordinary together, a training program that was changing emergency response, a relationship that was healing both their hearts, and a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. The storm that had brought them together had taught them both that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult circumstances. And now, with a national program to build and a life to share, they were ready to weather whatever storms lay ahead, together. 2 years later, Max stood at the podium of the National Emergency Management Conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of over 500 emergency responders, military personnel, and government officials. The PowerPoint slide behind him showed statistics that still amazed him. The National Civilian Military Emergency Response Program had trained over 2,000 volunteers across 12 states, with documented success rates that exceeded all initial projections. When we started this program, Max began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium, we had a simple goal: to bridge the gap between civilian and military emergency response. What we discovered was something much more profound, that The most effective rescues happen when people with different skills and perspectives work together toward a common purpose. In the third row, he could see Kira sitting with Sophie, both of them wearing proud smiles. Sophie, now 10 years old, had grown into a confident, articulate young woman who spoke fluent military base and could navigate the complexities of their blended family with remarkable grace. The program has documented over 400 successful rescue operations in the past 18 months, Max continued, clicking to the next slide. But the real success isn't in the numbers. It's in the transformation of how we think about emergency response, how we think about community, and how we think about the responsibility we have to help each other. Max paused, looking down at his notes, then decided to set them aside. I want to tell you a story about a night 2.5 years ago when everything I thought I knew about courage, about calling, and about second chances was proven wrong. He told them about the storm, about the voice on the radio, about the choice between safety and service. He told them about finding Kira in that frozen cabin, about the dangerous journey back to civilization, about the moment when he realized that running away from his calling hadn't made him safer, it had made him smaller. That night, I thought I was saving Captain Thorne's life, Max said, his voice growing quieter as the audience leaned forward. What I discovered was that she was saving mine. In the audience, Kira wiped away a tear. She'd heard Max tell this story dozens of times during training presentations, but it never failed to move her. Beside her, Sophie reached over and squeezed her hand, a gesture that had become natural over the past 2 years. The National Civilian Military Emergency Response Program exists because of that night, Max continued. Not because of the rescue itself, but because of what the rescue taught us about the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when they stop running from who they're meant to be. The presentation concluded to thunderous applause. Max answered questions from the audience, discussed funding for program expansion, and participated in a panel about the future of emergency response. But his mind was already on the evening ahead, dinner with his family, followed by a quiet celebration of another milestone in their remarkable journey. Later that evening, Max, Kira, and Sophie sat on the back porch of their home in Colorado Springs, watching the sunset behind the mountains. The house was larger than their apartment on base, with a workshop for Max's woodworking projects and a garden where Kira had discovered an unexpected talent for growing vegetables. "Dad, your speech was really good today," Sophie said, looking up from the book she was reading. "But you left out the part about how you were scared," Max smiled. "You think I should have mentioned that?" "Yeah, because being scared and doing it anyway is braver than not being scared at all. At least that's what you always tell me." Kira laughed. "She's got you there." "Your daughter is very wise," Max said, pulling Kira closer on the porch swing they'd installed last spring. "Our daughter," Kira corrected gently. The adoption had been finalized 6 months ago, just a week after their wedding. Sophie had been the one to suggest it, asking Kira if she wanted to be her real bonus mom instead of just a practice bonus mom. The legal ceremony had been simple, but the emotional weight of it had been profound. 3 people who had found each other in the storm, officially becoming a family. "I got an email from Sheriff Martinez in Timber Ridge today," Max said. "Their new search and rescue coordinator graduated from our training program last month. He said they've had 3 successful operations since then, including a winter rescue. That probably wouldn't have been possible without the coordination protocols we developed." "That's incredible," Kira said. "It's like ripples spreading out from that first storm." "Speaking of storms," Sophie said, looking up at the evening sky, "is it supposed to rain tonight?" Max checked his phone. "Actually, yes. There's a storm system moving in from the west. Nothing like the blizzard that brought us all together. But we might get some thunder and lightning." "Good," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "I like storms now. They remind me that good things can come from scary things." As if summoned by her words, the first rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. Max felt Kira's hand slip into his, and he thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A crashed airplane, a desperate radio call, a choice between safety and service, all of it leading to a life he couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. "Max," Kira said softly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't heard my radio call that night?" Max considered the question. "I think about it sometimes. But I've come to believe that some things are meant to happen. Maybe. Not the crash itself, but the rescue, our meeting, all of this. You think it was fate? I think it was a lot of things. Fate, maybe. But also choice, training, courage, the willingness to risk everything for something that matters." Sophie looked up from her book. "I think it was Mom." Max and Kira turned to her, surprised. Sophie rarely talked about Sarah anymore, not because she'd forgotten her, but because she'd found a way to carry her memory that didn't hurt. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Max asked. "I think Mom sent the storm to bring Kira to us. Because she knew we needed her, and she needed us. That's what moms do. They take care of their families, even when they can't be there." Max felt tears spring to his eyes. "I think you might be right." "I know I'm right," Sophie said with the confidence of someone who had figured out something important about how the world worked. "Besides, Kira makes really good pancakes now." "Almost as good as yours, almost," Kira protested, laughing. "Dad still makes better pancakes," Sophie said diplomatically. "But you make better hot chocolate." As the storm moved closer, they moved inside to watch the lightning through the living room windows. The walls were covered with photos from their life together, Max and Kira at various training exercises, Sophie at her school art show, the three of them at their wedding, group photos from the national conference. But the photo that held the place of honor on the mantle was one that had been taken during their first joint training exercise. Max and Kira stood beside a rescue helicopter, both of them wearing flight suits and serious expressions. Between them was Sophie, grinning broadly, and wearing a junior flight suit that Kira had gotten specially made for her. "I have an announcement," Kira said as they settled on the couch to watch the storm. "I got a call from the Pentagon today. They want to expand the program internationally. They're asking if we'd be interested in setting up training exchanges with NATO countries." Max stared at her. "International expansion. Emergency response is a global challenge. Natural disasters, humanitarian crises, mass casualty events, they happen everywhere. And the need for effective coordination between civilian and military assets is universal." "That would be incredible," Max said. "The impact we could have." "There's more," Kira continued. "They want to establish a permanent training center, a flagship facility that would serve as the model for programs worldwide. They're offering us the chance to design it from the ground up." Sophie looked up from her book. "Would that mean more travel for you guys?" "Some," Kira admitted. "But it would also mean building something permanent, something that could train thousands of people over the coming decades." Max thought about the magnitude of what she was describing. A permanent training center, international cooperation, the chance to influence emergency response on a global scale. It was beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first heard Kira's voice on the radio. "What do you think?" he asked Sophie. Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important family decisions. "I think we should do it. I think we should help as many people as we can, wherever they are. Even if it means being busier. Even if it means some changes to our routine. Dad, we've been changing and adapting our whole lives. Besides, I'm going to be a pilot someday, so I'll probably travel a lot anyway." "A pilot?" Kira asked, surprised. "Yeah, I want to be a flight surgeon like you, but I also want to learn how to fly helicopters. I figure if I can do both, I can help people in even more ways." Max and Kira exchanged glances, both of them amazed by the young woman their daughter was becoming. Sophie had absorbed the values of service and courage that defined their work, but she'd also maintained the optimism and wonder that made her uniquely herself. "I think," Max said slowly, "that we should accept the offer. All of us together." "All of us?" Kira asked. "Sophie's right. We're a team. We make these decisions together, and we face whatever comes next together." The storm outside was reaching its peak, lightning illuminating the mountains and thunder rolling across the valley. But inside their home, the three of them sat in comfortable warmth, planning a future that would honor the past while embracing possibilities they were only beginning to imagine. "You know what I love most about storms now?" Max said, pulling both his wife and daughter closer. "What?" they asked in unison. "They remind me that the most beautiful things in life often come from the most challenging circumstances, and that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in service to others." As the storm raged outside, Max Palmer thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a broken man hiding from his calling to a husband and father building something that would impact lives around the world. From a single voice on a radio to a family that had grown from tragedy and choice and love. The storm that had brought them together had done more than just test their courage. It had awakened their hearts to the truth that the most powerful rescues are the ones that save not just lives, but souls. And sometimes, the person you set out to save ends up being the one who saves you. Outside, the storm began to quiet, but inside their home, Max Palmer and his family were just beginning to dream about the lives they would touch, the rescues they would make possible, and the legacy they would build together. One storm, one rescue, one brave choice at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.